Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. The topic today is academic boycott of Israel. And we have three guests to talk about this topic and have a good discussion about it. Kehaulani Kauanui, she is Associate Professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University. And Cynthia Franklin, she is Professor of English at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. And George Hudes, he's a community activist and very active in this particular topic in terms of the boycott beyond the academic as well. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for coming. And we would like to start by asking each of you to say more about how you became involved in this particular topic, and what is the relationship to your other activities, political and social activities. So we start with Kehaulani.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. It's good to be here, Ibrahim. I became involved in Palestinian solidarity activism in 2009 when the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel was founded in the midst of Operation Cast Lead, when I was asked to be on the advisory board. And I had tracked and followed Palestine politics to some degree, actually since 1993 when I met Asma Khader, who was one of the international judges for Kauanui, Kanakamali, the Hawaii International People's Tribunal. And she drew parallels between the Kanakamali situation and the Palestinian people's situation and really hammered those comparisons home for me. And since then, I've really tried to educate myself and learn more about the situation. I also serve as an ASA elected member of the National Council, that is the American Studies Association, which recently passed, the membership recently passed a resolution endorsing the academic boycott of Israeli institutions. And so this issue has become, very prominent in the last few months in terms of the U.S. national scenario, in terms of the backlash against this kind of resolution. And the ASA is one of four within the United States that have actually passed solidarity statements endorsing the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel.
Yeah, and just for our viewers, Operation Cast Lead is the Israeli attack on Gaza, right? And
yes.
That's like created a lot of international, exposure for the Israeli attack and the Palestinians defending themselves from that. Just to let our people know. And Cindy, so.
So my way into this has many different threads. Some of them come from growing up in a kind of unthinkingly Zionist household where it was just assumed that Israel was the rightful place for Jews, and I didn't really question that until college, and then felt a kind of responsibility to find out more. Another thread more recently was doing some work on Hannah Arendt's Eichmann trial and presenting a conference paper where I was looking at why that trial, the kind of role that trial played in state building for Israel and Arendt's anti-Zionism. And I was pretty astonished at the time. Now it seems unsurprising to me by the response I got, which was just a kind of hostility unlike that I've ever experienced. People telling me that my behavior was inappropriate, that I had no business talking in the way that I did about Israel at a conference, that it was unprofessional. And so that got me more interested in terms of the extremity of that response. And then I went to Palestine last spring as part of the a faculty development seminar that Kehaulani actually told me about. And that got me most interested in the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, and in PACB and US ACB in particular, because I was supportive before I went, but I was so struck when I was traveling through the West Bank that I did not meet a single person that did not say, please support BDS, please support the movement for academic and cultural boycott. I was there as an academic. And that was, that was pretty powerful to me. Everyone from the people driving the buses to the people working in the hotels to university presidents, mayors, faculty members, they all said this is the way we can nonviolently resist occupation, colonization, apartheid, and please support this. So when I came back, became part of the organizing collective of the U.S. Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, that campaign, and was active in the ASA caucus that put forward the resolution. I came to it later than Kehaulani, but have worked on it pretty intensively the last few months.
Yes, yeah.
So.
And George?
I would ditto a number of things that Cindy said. I grew up in a very Orthodox and Zionist family. I think the roots of my own epiphany that something was radically wrong go back to 1959 when I first visited Israel. Certain things happened that didn't seem right, and later in the 60s, as I gained a better understanding of world events, I was able to put those things in their place. And ever since then, I've tried to speak out and had the same accusations leveled against me as Cindy. I think we were probably on panels together in the 70s or 80s. In terms of specific engagement with boycott and divestment, I went again in 2004 and spent time in the West Bank in Hebron, and was there when Yasser Arafat died. And it was an emotionally wrenching confirmation of everything that I had read about. Emotionally wrenching, not only to see what was being suffered by people there, but also emotionally wrenching because I thought it was the twisting and corruption of a heritage that had been a gift to me. But it was not only in the West Bank. I didn't go to Gaza, but it's also in so-called Israel proper, the pre-67 Israel. It's a highly discriminatory society. All one has to do is visit the Palestinian communities, and that becomes very clear. So I became first specifically involved in boycott and divestment in 2005 when I was asked to go to the United Church of Christ Synod in Atlanta to speak for a divestment resolution, which did pass.
Yeah. So actually, talking about academic boycott of Israel, it's in the context of boycott, divestment, and sanctions that really has been growing and developing very quickly, especially even in the United States, actually. So could you say something about that, Kehaulani?
Sure, thank you. I also just want to acknowledge I took part in a delegation as well, and it was for the U.S. ACB delegation to Palestine in January 2011. And I went with 4 other scholars, and it was on that trip actually that we met with leaders from sectors of Palestinian civil society, and they are the ones who have called, as you know, for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So BDS, for people, your viewers who are unfamiliar with that, is represented by Palestinian civil society, putting the call out to the rest of the world to actually put non-punitive pressure, non-violent, non-punitive pressure on Israel to comply with 3 different precepts of international law. And the Palestinian civil society that made this call is represented by 170 non-governmental organizations, unions, and is very representative. And so part of it is really responding to that call, or responding to the kahea, as we put it.
Wonderful. And would you say something about the context, so far as you're concerned, for BDS context?
Well, I mean, maybe what I would do is just say what the 3 main points are, just in terms of the first would be to end occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantle the what Israel calls the security fence, what is called the separation wall or the apartheid wall. It is, when it's completed, I think it's going to run about 800 meters, kilometers rather, I'm sorry. That would be a very short wall. And about 85% of that is inside, Palestinian occupied territory. So that is, and it's been deemed illegal under international law. The other thing is to recognize the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and George talked about how much that is not the case. And I think there are over 50 laws that distinguish inside of Israel between Israeli and Palestinian, between Israelis and Palestinians. The other is to protect and respect, protect, and promote the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. And that one, I think, is particularly contentious for people that might be against occupation, but want to protect Israel as a Jewish state. And it really does, I think, make clear, I think, the tensions between a Jewish state and a democracy, since Israel is very interested in promoting itself as a Jewish democracy. And I think that it would be a very big, I can't think of very many ways in which Israel is a democratic state right now. And I think a lot of it rests on the special treatment given to Jewish people who have a right to become citizens, and then Palestinians who have lost and are continuing to lose their homes and their properties and be separated from their family members.
Like a few days ago, I was watching a TV program, and one of the people there said, well, he's speaking with an American accent, he said, well, I immigrated to Israel because it is something that I wanted to do, like an indigenous person returning to his own land. So any comments on that, George?
I don't share that perspective. It's a romance. Actually, in the world Jewish community, for almost 2,000 years, that was regarded as, if I can use the term, beyond the pale. That whole concept of actually going back. So reunite. It's a romance. It's a total romance. That concept of reuniting with one's roots, when one has no understanding of the land in terms of the environment, the people who live there and have lived there for centuries, the flora and the fauna, and what makes that land live. I mean, the yearning for a homeland, we can all understand that. But for an American to do this, I simply don't understand it. I have cousins who have done the same type of thing. I cannot understand it, especially when it involves the egregious transgression of the rights of Palestinians. If you actually read the press, not a day goes by without state terrorism, let me be clear about that, being wreaked against Palestinians by Israel. And in most of the press, we don't see that. So for me, boycott, divestment, sanctions, I don't have a particular agenda. There are different groups that have different agendas as to what, let's do this until this occurs. My own attitude is that Israel has benefited from a kind of an exceptionalism for over a half a century. And it is time that ended. And it is like the child in a family who has been beating up other children. For me personally, I view it is the responsibility of the members of that family, and I say that as a Jew, to curb the violent actions and the violations of other rights by that member of the family. And I say it as an American too, because the United States has, at least since the 70s, been the major sponsor of Israeli exceptionalism. So what the exact solutions are to the right of return, in other words, just how it's realized, I'm not going to say. That's for Palestinians to say, and to try to get agreement from Israelis. And of course, that has to be worked out. But the situation is such an egregious violation of rights that it is time for some sanctions. And the divestment, the boycotts, are long overdue.
You want to jump in? Yeah.
Right. I want to actually piggyback on that point. I mean, I think that this is one of the myths, and it goes back to this question of an ethnocracy versus a democracy. And part of that is the lure of Jews being drawn into a colonial project that's undergirded by Zionist ideology. And I think one of the most critical points, and I hear this coming through in what you're saying, is to parse the distinctions between Judaism and Zionism. Zionism as a political ideology that undergirds the colonial ethnocracy that is Israel. And part of that, we know, comes from European Jews colonizing Palestine and then opening up Israel to the rest of the world in terms of people who identify as Jewish individuals to go there in terms of a Jewish right of return. And this is why the Palestinian right of return, is seen as such a problem in terms of people protecting a Jewish state, is they consider Palestinians a demographic threat. And I see this as linked to what Patrick Wolf, who I know has been to Hawaii many times, theorizes as settler colonialism, which is different than franchise colonialism. I always explain it to my students as the difference between England and India and England and North America. And he talks about the logic of the elimination of the native. And it's really all about removing Palestinian people from their homeland. And it's not unlike removing Chamorros from Guam or the push to remove Kanaka Maoli from our homeland here in Kapai'aina o Hawaii. And so I think that part of what needs to be parsed out for people who are unfamiliar with this is the myth that this is some ancient religious ethnic feud rather than something that is really undergirded by something in the late 1800s that is really about European Jewish colonialism in Palestine. There are indigenous Jews. They're the Arab ones, So I don't see this as a religious issue, even though the religious angle has been used to try and uphold this apartheid colonial occupation. And I see Israel as all three of those. It's an apartheid state, it maintains an occupation, and it's a settler colonial society. And we know what's at the center of any settler colonial society and why it relies on the logic of the elimination of the native is that land is at the center of any settler colonial project.
Thank you. And I would just add that as a colonial project, it is so rooted in European colonialism, and the advocacy for a Jewish state in Palestine long antedates the Zionist project. And that was by the British under Palmerston, Lord Shaftesbury, who saw this as a way, it was a kind of a Christian Zionism of hastening the second coming of Christ, and also being an outpost for British colonialism in the Middle East. So it's so rooted in a European colonial ideology that is not necessarily Jewish. I'm not sure what ethnic, title to put on it, but it's colonialism that's rooted in Europe.
I really appreciated what you were saying about the perversion of something that you had felt was a gift when you were talking about Judaism. And I was thinking about that when one of the people I traveled with sent home some business cards from Palestinian academics and some field notes that he had taken and some, while we were visiting different universities, and some maps. And when he got his package, and there was no attempt to get those things through Ben Gurion Airport because we were told unless it's souvenir material, don't even try. months later, his package arrived, and it had Torah in it, in Greek. And that is a perversion of, of Judaism. And I think that, as Kehaulani was saying, there is this sense when you talk to people, the first thing they'll say is, oh, it's such a mess there. There's all this hate, religious hate on either side. It's centuries of religious hate. And that's been, it's nice to, not nice, it's very important to see that changing in young Jewish people today. I think the movement in Hillel's to say, to kind of call for attention to looking at what academic boycott is, to thinking about anti-Zionist critique coming into those Hillels is a new thing in terms of the last few decades.
If you explain to our viewers, Hillel.
They're traditionally just the kind of Jewish organization that has typically been quite Zionist, right? And it's a gathering point for young Zionist Jews.
Right. Yeah.
It's named after one of the great, almost mythological teachers in the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Hillel, who said, and this is often quoted, if I'm not for myself, who am I? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? And I think on the part of too much Zionist ideology, there's been the dropping. If I am for myself alone, what am I? And I think many people, and every tradition has different interpretations, whether it's, I imagine, I can't speak as an expert, but whether it's Hindu or Buddhist or Islam or Christian or Jewish, every tradition has different interpretations. But I think the tragedy is for some Jewish people today, and for those who suffer because of it, that it's the right-wing side of the tradition which has been manipulated to try to control world events.
Yeah, Kehaulani.
Right, and I want to just also, go back to something that you said around Christian Zionism. And I think that that's something that we also need to be really attentive to, that there's Jewish Zionism and there's Christian Zionism, and both are upholding this ethnocracy. And I think that we can't let Christian Zionism off the hook at all for that. We see right now the Israeli government is courting tribal nations across North America, appealing to Christian Zionist indigenous people, and trying to make this cross-indigenous claim of support Israeli indigeneity, when other indigenous peoples are making the indigenous link with Palestinians. And so I think that that's something that needs attention. And I think that your point around British colonial outpost is really important. And we see now that the way that the U.S. is using Israel in that way, right? Israel is a U.S. client state. And I think that one of the things that I get asked in BDS activist work from people who are protective and very pro-Israeli will say, why single out Israel? And it's the U.S. and the rest of the world that singles out Israel in terms of the funding, in terms of the United States government using its UN veto power at the Security Council to veto every single resolution that the General Assembly passes to censure Israel. And so, part of this is, when you say about the family, and the bully kid in the family, you could think about that in terms of the family of nations. And you have the U.S. abusing its power as a bully in terms of its global power to protect its, younger brother, if you will.
And I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, as there's growing and really a kind of turning of the tide in terms of, I think, BDS and ASA was a kind of flashpoint in that resolution. I don't think anybody expected that to have the impact that it did, and to be receiving front page coverage on the New York Times and on Israeli papers. And, I think that as that kind of, as the support is growing, so too is this kind of viciousness to try and squelch it, and a kind of panic. And, I thought of that in terms of Netanyahu's response at APEC in Los Angeles, a few weeks ago when he said, I can't remember the exact language, but he basically said anybody that supports this is an anti-Semite and a criminal. And I think that kind of extremity of rhetoric registers a kind of panic that is happening as, the LA Times did a forum on the boycott movement, which I think is really unusual. And just the amount of actually, kind of acknowledging this movement in mainstream US papers seems to me something that wasn't happening a few months ago. It's become part of a public discourse in a new way, which I think is quite remarkable.
Yeah, but the question is, what is Israel doing that other places, other states are not doing? This is the question why I single out Israel. But also, are there any parallels, for instance, between the previous South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and the state of Israel? And apartheid South Africa, we know some of the work that was being done against it internationally was the boycott and the sanctions and the divestment. So could you make some parallels, Cindy, because you had done some work on that?
Well, actually, I suspect Kehaulani has done more than I, but I do think that, first of all, in terms of why Israel, one reason is there are 170 civil societies and civil organizations asking for international help to remedy these extreme human rights violations when governments like the U.S. not only they're not simply sitting on their hands, they're spending $300 billion in tax, dollars a year.
3 billion.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Between 3 and 5.
Hard
to trace all the money.
$3 billion is a lot of money. Okay, so we're funding this occupation.
It's the biggest chunk of our foreign aid.
So I think, in terms
country.
of why, we have an exceptional relationship to Israel. We also have a call from Palestinians. I think we would heed, people were saying, why isn't ASA addressing any of these other places? I actually think ASA would be quite, willing to do that if we received a call. And I think that there have been a number of parallels to South Africa. And I know that AAAS, in fact, or the Association for Asian American Studies, which passed a resolution supporting academic boycott, actually pointed in their language leading up to the resolution to South Africa and, presented that as a similar kind of movement and a similar kind of time in history when the world is watching and saying, this is what we can do to stop these really egregious human rights violations.
Yeah. And as part of the boycott, divestment, sanctions, I mean, there are a lot of churches who have divested from some Israeli businesses and so forth. And in terms of boycott, they are boycotting certain goods and so forth. But and this is the context in which the academic boycott is happening. So could you say something more or follow what Cindy has said about the academic boycott?
Sure. I want to just let viewers know that it's the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel was founded in 2004 prior to the broader BDS movement's call in terms of the 170 Palestinian civil society organizations. And so there's a relationship. So in a sense, academic and cultural boycott took the lead in forming the BDS movement. And for those who are new to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we're talking about academic boycott is one angle, and it's a boycott of academic institutions or cultural institutions. There's also product boycott, right? So, boycotting anything that's made in Israel.
SodaStream.
Right,
SodaStream.
SodaStream. Perfect example, very timely one with Scarlett Johansson coming out as a Zionist and, doing advertisements for them, which I think is really a shame. It's really a shame. But then you've got the sanctions piece, which isn't, at least from the U.S. end, going to happen because the U.S. is bankrolling Israel, but that doesn't mean that other countries can't participate in that. But the divestment piece is another part. I see academic boycott as a withholding, and that's why I called it non-punitive earlier. A lot of people say, why are you punishing Israeli academics as individuals? And there's this misunderstanding or intentional, willful misconstrual of the campaign by saying you're punishing or violating the academic freedom of individual Israeli academics, and that's just ridiculous. If I, Kehaulani Kauanui, say no to an invitation, not like I'd be invited, to give a lecture at Tel Aviv University on Hawaiian sovereignty, me saying no to that invitation, who would think that that violates an Israeli academic's academic freedom? As though their
or
academic
your own,
freedom,
for that matter,
or my
because
own.
you're free to
Is
accept
my talk
or not.
really going, them not getting to hear my talk is going to violate their academic freedom or my own? It's a withholding. It's not a punishment. It's actually a withholding. And so I think that part of what we need to hammer in terms of the public piece of educating people around the politics of academic boycott and what it is and what it isn't, is that it's a boycott of academic institutions. It's a withholding. In the ASA case, it's not even about individual academics in the U.S. It says that the association itself will not go into partnership with an Israeli academic institution. It doesn't prohibit any members from doing that. But the difference between that individual piece and the institutional piece is that I can still, if there's an academic in Israel who's writing on indigenous solidarity politics, there's nothing in me abiding by the US ACB call or the PACB call that prohibits me from collaborating with that individual scholar. It really is about me saying no to make my presence in those institutions and to be in partnership with academics when they're in their official capacity representing the school itself.
I think it's important also that we understand, correct me if I'm wrong about this, that the boycott of the academic institutions doesn't even prevent somebody from inviting a very strong Zionist advocate from Israel as an individual to speak. That person is still free to speak, but not as a representative, not in the institutional context. Nobody's rights to speak, to be heard, are being violated. And the notion that this is a violation of freedom of speech and individual rights, this is woven out of whole cloth. This is like talking about, the rights of corporations as individuals. I mean,
that's right. It's a lot of propaganda around that to confuse the issue. But two things. One is that a number of Israeli professors, academics, have called for the boycott of Israeli institutions, academic institutions. And these guys would be invited to speak in the United States, to groups, to all kinds of stuff. So they are themselves asking for, to respect the call from the indigenous population, the Palestinians, to boycott academic institutions and, the BDS, the larger
and some
BDS.
have been critical. They weren't able to find work anymore in Israel, like Ilan Pape. But there have been others who, people have called for the dismissal.
Gordon case as well.
And one thing, before we go any further, I like to show the resolution of the American Studies Association. So it's on my laptop here, if we can. It is resolved that the American Studies Association, ASA, endorses and will honor the call of Palestinian civil society for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. It is also resolved that the ASA supports the protected rights of students and scholars everywhere to engage in research and public speaking about Israel-Palestine, and in support of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, BDS movement. I mean, that's all what it says. Now, how did we arrive at that? I mean, you folks have been quite instrumental in fighting for this resolution. So, Kehaulani, you want to?
Sure. Well, it actually did start with 5 people, but we didn't say we were going to ram it through. We said we were going to try and mobilize and introduce it. The immediate origins of the current academic boycott resolution at the ASA actually came out of the US ACB delegation that I was part of with 4 other scholars. That included Robin D.G. Kelly, Bill Mullins, Nefertiti Tadiar, and Nikhil Singh. And on our last day of the delegation, we were in a cafe in Ramallah and actually drew up a list of things that we wanted to do once we went home, because we met so many people throughout the journey who said, you know, please go back and please find ways to support BDS. And Bill Mullen had left, he'd already flown out, but we were working with him by email, and we were with our host Majid Shihadeh at the cafe and trying to strategize how to move this within the ASA. That was in January 2011. We worked with a broader group, and by the annual meeting of the ASA in November 2012 in Puerto Rico, co-chairs of the Academic and Community Activism Caucus within the ASA, which I'm part of and Cindy is also part of. And I should just point out, I'm not speaking for for the National Council or even the caucus or even USACB. I'm speaking right now just as an individual, giving my perspective on this genealogy. But at the meeting in November 2012, the annual meeting of the ASA, Sunaina Mayra, who co-organized the USACB delegation, she co-chaired the Activism Caucus with Malini Johar Schuler and put on the agenda the resolution issue. And over 80 people attended that meeting, and a core group within the caucus presented a draft to everybody who attended. There was a petition to the ASA Council and Executive Committee in particular to support the resolution, and it was a brainstorm session in terms of how to actually educate the membership and mobilize support for the resolution. That was publicized the next month in December 2012, and this is a really important piece of the history because it's been also misconstrued as though this came out last minute and that members didn't have a chance to voice opposition or that it wasn't vetted. This had a lot of lead time on it. So in December 2012, this news was published in the newsletter that went to the entire membership of the ASA, that it would be, that it was presented at that time to the Executive Committee of the National Council. And when the Executive Committee of the National Council met in May 2013, they decided to take it to the Council at large. And that's their prerogative, but I mean, they have the prerogative to vote on it themselves. But they decided to take it to the broader National Council, and the broader National Council, and this is before I was elected into office, decided to take it to the annual meeting in November 2014, which took place in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, I was elected onto a National Council seat, as was Sunaina Mayra. And so we had this overlap in terms of our position on the Activism Caucus. But the point that I want to make is how the council dealt with it, but also that this was a massive group effort. I mean, the people that attended the meeting in Puerto Rico took this far and wide, and once other people who hadn't been at that meeting found out about it, came into the caucus, and the caucus as a group, a massive group effort, did a lot of work for that entire year, from November to November 2012 to 2013. And by the time we were in DC, there was tabling, the petition had expanded, and we knew at that time that the National Council was going to vote on the matter. National Council made extra effort to allow the members to participate and treated it unlike any other resolution in the history of the ASA, which is another form of exceptionalism, right? But, you know, because this is controversial, because some people knew this was going to be a political hot potato before I came on to council, said, you know, we really need to have more spaces for members to really address and talk and debate this issue. There was an open forum on it. There was a town hall meeting that the ASA president, Curtis Merez, organized. And there were panels that were organized. And I also want to acknowledge the longtime labor of other ASA members prior to the USACB delegation even pitching the idea of a resolution. As early as 2006 and again up until 2009, other members had actually, it was also in the midst of when Israel was bombing Gaza and Lebanon in 2006 and bombing Gaza in 2009, really pushed to have the International Committee and the Executive Committee sponsor sessions at the council meeting. So our delegation that pitched the resolution built on this long labor that other people actually had done, and there was a longer genealogy of activist work within the ASA that wasn't particular to a resolution, but was particular to the Palestinian plight, as well as the politics of boycott. And so at the meeting, it was really clear from the town hall meeting and the open forum that the members, were really in support of this. You could tell from being at these fora what the vibe was like in the room, if you will. In the end, though, council decided to take it to the members, and members got to vote on it. And ASA members voted 2-1 to support the resolution.
Wonderful. Thank you for this great detail in the explanation, because it's really needed. One of the things the detractors say about the ASA resolution, and we have to talk also about the other resolutions in academic associations as well later on. But the detractors would say something, well, this is not only like you singling out Israel, but this is against academic freedom and so forth. But no one, and this is here where the erasure issue is concerned, insofar as the Palestinian indigenous population is concerned, is that nobody talks about the academic freedom of the Palestinians and whether academic students, what have you. So could you say something about that?
Sure. I think that I have a few things to say about that. One is about scholars who are in the U.S., and one of the things that was very striking at the town hall meeting and the open meeting was there were a lot of students there, and there were a lot of Palestinian American students there, and they were a big part of this. Students for Justice in Palestine were there helping with the tabling, and they were at the meeting and they're snapping their fingers in support of things people were saying. They were getting up and speaking very eloquently and talking also about their limitations of academic freedom. But the other thing, and this was brought out very powerfully in the LA Times forum that was just ran by Nora Ericott about, in this whole, kind of hoopla about academic freedom, she's saying the people that are complaining about that are not looking at, first of all, just the extremity of human rights violations against Palestinians. Let's not even talk about academic freedom. And she opens with an account of a woman who finds Israeli settlers entering her house and saying, this is our house now. And that, the kinds of home demolitions, of takeovers of homes, all of these things that, whether someone can attend a conference or not and be funded, really pale in comparison to. So there is that. The other thing is just that, I think academic freedom became so emptied of any content over the course of this debate that it meant anything from, well, I can't get paid to I can't accept my Fulbright and therefore I'm oppressed. That was, about the most compelling thing I heard from somebody about how their academic freedom would be limited, because at least it was something small and measurable. I would call that an inconvenience of conscience, since no one would, be prohibited from taking that Fulbright if they wanted to, so they might have to feel bad about it, which I just really don't think is a limit to their academic freedom. But I do think it became this word or this phrase that obscured the ways that Palestinians daily have their right to education violated. They can't get to school when they can't pass through checkpoints to even get to their classes. They have all these forms of discrimination and obstacles to teach or take their classes. Their materials are censored. There is, a prohibition against teaching the Nakba. So there are so many impediments to academic freedom that Palestinians experience on a daily basis, that Palestinian Americans experience, and none of those things were addressed. And one of the things that I think was pointed out, and that was quite striking about the 150 or so condemnations from university administrators and mostly presidents, was none of them talked about any of that. None of them.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing I want to ask you. Like, how come then all these university presidents or chancellors or what have you go and condemn the ASA and other organizations, academic associations like Association for Asian American Studies, which actually was the first one to do it a year before that, I think. Yeah. Did you go to that meeting, AAAS?
No, that was in April 2014.
Yeah. Okay. No.
It's 13, pardon me.
13, yeah.
April
right,
2013
right.
is when
So,
the
yeah.
Asian American Studies
Yeah.
Association.
So you know, it's interesting. They didn't say anything about that, those chancellors and presidents. So why is it that they felt compelled to say something in support of Israeli, what I would say, apartheid? You know, why do you think they were compelled? Any of you? Yeah, George.
Let me give an example from right here at the University of Hawaii. About 2 years ago, we presented a petition to the University of Hawaii Foundation calling for divestment from investments in Israeli industries in the occupation. We had enough signatures on that, over 500. We did get a meeting with the
UHF, University of Hawaii Foundation.
UH Foundation, that's right. We had a meeting with the chair of the board and the executive director. And we were told point blank that even though the motto of the University of Hawaii is, above all nations, humanity, this was not their concern when it came to investments. Their job was to raise money. And they could not be bothered with that. I mean, we were told that in pretty much as many words. And so I can only imagine, even though I can't look into the mind and heart of every university administrator, that ultimately it's the funding and getting the political patronage and all that somehow pressures are brought to bear to tell people, just follow the money. We don't want too much humanitarianism. We don't want too many ethical concerns entering the university, especially things that we don't control, because at that point, it's an open field and we can lose control.
Yeah, and I'm thinking like in a number of instances, like some of those presidents might have been like in one of the administrations, you know, like secretary of this, secretary of that, yeah. So a few come to mind. And so they are close to the American foreign policy. And of course, American foreign policy is pro-Israel, and it uses Israel as an instrument in that particular area we call the Middle East, to influence and affect U.S. interests in that area.
I would add as a footnote that I don't think we no longer have the kind of uniform mentality in all those who work in the State Department and in U.S. foreign policy. Somebody made a statement to me back in the 90s. They were working in Congress. They said, George, the disgust with the sponsorship of Israel is palpable among staff. And while there may not be any outside sign of it, one day it may just come crashing down. And we have seen examples of, you know, voices within State Department professionals who don't see what we're doing as being in long-term U.S. interests. And they try to raise their voice. They're, you know, shut up. So I don't think it is the uniform mentality that it once was. And I think there are breaks that are occurring, fractures. We haven't seen it fall apart yet, but I think the fractures are there.
That's a good point. And there has been quite a bit of research about, you know, whether Israel is a liability, you know, or an asset for Israel from a while back, like 20 years, 30 years ago, and even now. So that is an important thing. But I just wanted to show the question of the relationship between American foreign policy and those kinds of positions.
You know, I think the Modern Language Association had a very mild resolution before the Delegate Assembly this year, and I was there at that Delegate Assembly meeting and at the discussions before it. And the resolution was, you know, the State Department has documented that Palestinian Americans have trouble entering the West Bank. So this resolution was put some pressure on the State Department to condemn Israel's discrimination that the State Department itself has documented against Palestinian Americans trying to enter for jobs and so on. And first of all, this was treated as like a gateway drug to BDS. And, you know, people kept calling it a boycott resolution. And it is so far from a boycott resolution. It is so mild. I don't know if this will pass a vote by the membership, but I think it's, you know, significant that just any kind of criticism of Israel gets so quickly coded as anti-Semitism. And I think that is the ideological component that, you know, is working in tandem with the economic interests. And so to prize apart this kind of conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is really, really important, but quite difficult to do. I mean, I think it's happening, and in some ways a ratcheting up of these cries of anti-Semitism anytime Israel is criticized are becoming less convincing to people as the violations get more documented and more well known. But I do think that in terms of the university presidents, some of that is that kind of absolute conflation of any kind of criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic. And this weird substitution of, I mean, weird as in ahistorical and indefensible in every way you can count, of that another Holocaust will happen, and that in this way that equates Arabs and Nazis, when in fact, you know, you have this, you know, you have Israeli Jews colonizing and occupying Palestinians, and so there's no historical grounding for that kind of a movement. But it's very tricky to address that without, you know, people suggesting that you are anti-Semitic, or in my case, a self-hating Jew.
Kehaulani, you're Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Ibi. So, and you mentioned in the beginning about that relationship and what made you like be open to looking at the Palestinian issue or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you say something more about the relationship as you understand it, as you feel it, between the indigenous population in Hawaii and the indigenous population in Palestine?
Sure. I also just want to build on two quick things. I think one of the things I want to point out to viewers, just two quick points. One is that presidents across the U.S. did more than just come out and condemn the ASA. In many, many cases, they actually pulled and revoked their institutions. Even American Studies departments on their campus revoked their membership from the ASA in violation of their own faculty's academic freedom. And so there's that, and the other part is the erasure that Cindy spoke about. We're seeing such an incredible backlash across the country, and you spoke about, you know, the right to movement and entry for Palestinian American academics or those that are in exile as part of the diaspora, and those part of the diaspora. Part of that too is the backlash against scholars in the U.S. who are Palestinian and other Arabs have really had the brunt of that for so long. So I just wanted to acknowledge
and
that.
legislation too, right?
Right,
So.
because, and there's the legislative efforts in Illinois, Maryland, and New York.
And federal.
This is like
And
intellectual terrorism, as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to you know, like freedom of speech and so forth, what trumps it is the investments and the money that would come to an institution and so forth. I wanted, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to say that, but please go ahead.
Right, so just unprecedented backlash at the state level, the federal, and the federal legislative level. And these are punitive measures to punish people that are supporting boycott. In terms of the indigenous connection, I think one of the things that trips people up is this question around Palestinian indigeneity. And I don't know that that's necessarily the first place people need to go. I think we can actually just start by looking at the illegal occupation, the fact that apartheid's illegal, and that this is a colonial situation, and that that's what the commonalities are, right? I mean, I do acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people, but I think that people get in, that's where people get stuck, is in that contestation over indigeneity. We can respond on other grounds. It's the Palestinian Civil Society has put out the call that in and of itself can be the reason to actually step up and answer the call. The fact that it's a principled stance of the 3 precepts that that Cindy read from the campaigns themselves are about anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, anti-colonialism. Who can defend apartheid, colonialism, and occupation in the 21st century? I mean, besides the U.S. government, right? So, I mean, that's one of those things. But I think that cross-Indigenous solidarity is very important. I just think it's one of many kind of anchors or prongs into Palestine solidarity movement.
Yeah. And one thing we talked about before about Christian fundamentalism and Zionism. So Christian Zionists and Israeli Zionists or Jewish Zionists, yeah. But you find that there's more and more of a relationship between them, and the Christian Zionists here become a social base on top of AIPAC, which is America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is the Zionist lobby here, one of the main lobbies. On top of that, they become like a social basis for Israeli policies, pro-Israeli policies, and influence the Congress and even legislators legislatures in the various the respective 50 states and so on to try and take like pro-Israeli policies, right? And to the point that there sometimes would have like sister city between like city X in the U.S. and city Y in the state of Israel and Palestine, So all of this, I mean, is very important. How can we do something to keep the BDS and the academic boycott moving in the face of all these, propaganda and this power, social power, actually? Anyone?
This is a very small thing, but when I traveled as part of this faculty development seminar, I traveled with a number of people who are working at historically Black colleges and universities, and one of the reasons that this program likes to include those scholars is those colleges and universities are targeted by Israel to try and build these kind of Christian Zionist alliances and forms of connection. And so the people that I was traveling with, they were really interested in parallels between Jim Crow, the Jim Crow, South and Israel. And they are now going back to their colleges and universities and building movements there. And so I think just a lot of it is education. But I'm curious what other, what the two of you might
George?
think.
I think education, there are different communities in which people who have access to a little bit more historically accurate information can operate and try and educate. I mean, whether that the university is almost an exceptional place to be able to do that. It's much more difficult to do that in corporations. It can be very difficult to do that in various churches, regardless of the denomination. But it is being done, and I think just keep it up. I don't. The magic bullet. I don't know.
Any ideas in the last minute we have?
I think this really is about movement building, and I think one of the other issues is that this issue has really drawn or smoked out those who really are closeted Zionists who support Israel, and also drawn out people who support Palestine and Palestinians. And so I think that Students for Justice in Palestine are doing amazing work, and that it's up to faculty to support them. They're getting a lot of state backlash as well. And I think the connections between the Jim Crow South, the history of U.S. apartheid with the South Africa struggle of apartheid, and Palestine are really important pieces so long as the indigeneity piece doesn't drop out. And that's where I think we do need that settler colonial analysis so we can draw the parallels around the U.S. removal of tribal nations and U.S. colonial domination over indigenous peoples and how it also parallels.
Yeah. Well, we're basically flat out of time, so thank you all for coming. And thank you, viewers, and we'll see you next month. Aloha.